Good evening and welcome to this webinar as part of the Being Human series within the York Festival of Ideas programme. My name is Vicky Johnson and I'll be facilitating this evening's discussion. I work as the Canon Precentor at York Minster, overseeing the worship, music and prayer life that we offer each day. A few technical notes before I introduce our speaker. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin using the original link. And please also remember, this evening's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch again. Subtitles are available this evening. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen. I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Jessica Martin. Jessica was formerly a Fellow in English Literature at Trinity College, Cambridge, and is now a Canon of Ely Cathedral. She was a theological advisor to the Bishop's Working Party on Human Sexuality and is a member of the influential Littlemore group of theologians. Jessica has recently delivered the prestigious Bampton Lectures at the University Church, Oxford, and we're delighted that she is joining us this evening to speak to the title, Holiness and Desire, What Makes Us Who We Are? We hand over to Jessica for a pre-recorded talk, and then Jessica will join us live for Q&A. So over to Jessica.
Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really delighted to be here. In 2016, the singer and songwriter John Legend brought out a song dedicated to his newborn baby daughter. In it, he was thinking about the life that was stretching ahead of her and what she'd need. And the first question his song asked her was how she would find living in a world run by desire. And the way he framed his question was really haunting, even kind of sorrowful, as if living in a world run by desire was daunting, potentially destructive as well as powerful. And this got me thinking. It is a strange split thing to be a human being, to be this sentient animal, illuminated but also confined by what we can see, touch, taste, or otherwise know with our bodies. Our systems of measurement, our understandings of size, of shape, our whole perspective on the big world, let alone the universe, all these things are governed by the size and span of the physical bodies we inhabit. But at the same time, we human beings are animated by imagined truths, by our capacity to envision and to yearn for things way beyond our actual sight and touch and taste. Our mental range encompasses places infinitely larger and infinitely smaller than the bodies doing the imagining. We reach for intangibles, things that have no physical presence at all, like love, or justice, community, or faith. Across the planet, many of us human beings put our trust in an invisible God. I do myself. For me, a Christian, that invisible God was also historically made tangible in a real human being, Jesus, who chose our strange mix of fragility and power as the place to show us quite literally what love looks like. So round about the same time as John Legend brought out his song, I started writing a book called Holiness and Desire. And though what set it off was a disagreement within the church community about sexual behaviour in holiness, the question I wanted to ask was much larger than that. I wanted to ask how the intangible longings of human beings, including a longing for God, could be matched up with our small bodies and their many needs and wants. I wanted to think about the human capacity for desire and how it might be a wind blowing from beyond the world towards us. And John Legend's question was very much in my mind because of the way he put it. He talked about the world being run by desire, and he seemed to mean something a bit different and more specific than that we want stuff. He was implying that the way that we run our societies involves the manipulation of desire, some sort of drivenness. Desire and the promise of fulfillment seem to be something that might come to possess us rather than the other way round. And perhaps we were even being exploited through our desires. And alongside that, but in contrast to it, I was also really struck by another very different writer who wrote much longer ago, the mystic and poet of the 17th century, Thomas Traherne. And you'll see on your screen a quotation from Traherne, and this is what he said about human desire. I'll read it out to you. Wants are the bands and ligatures between God and us. Had we not wanted, we could never have been obliged. Whereas now we're infinitely obliged because we want infinitely. From eternity, it was requisite that we should want. We could never else have enjoyed anything. Our own wants are treasures. And if want be a treasure, sure everything is so. Well, I found this a really startling perspective because he seemed to be saying that the gap between wanting something and having it was a really precious one, because without it, as he put it, we could never else have enjoyed anything. Our wants are treasures, he said. In other words, desire itself was what made things valuable to us. And he didn't seem that interested in fulfillment. He wasn't against it. It just didn't seem to feature very much in his writing, even though it's very sensual, very vivid about how he experienced the world. So for Traherne, fulfillment didn't really seem to be the point of life. And instead, he focused on wanting, which in that century was a word very, very precisely balanced between meaning lacking something and desiring something. Well, none of this was very much like the world I know, where everything is about having and not much is about longing. So I thought about that. And he said something else, which really I found surprising. He said that the important thing about wanting was it showed us how obliged we are. He meant that when we see what we lack, we are connected by those webs of need to everything that we depend on for food, for shelter, for love, for meaning. In Traherne's eyes, all those needs led back to God, the giver of all good things, and the infinite obligation that he finds something to celebrate in could not be more different than our modern view of ourselves as autonomous, fully separated from each other, and only connected when we choose to be. Well, I wrote the whole of Holiness and Desire before the pandemic hit, because it came out in 2020. And during the last year and a bit, there's been quite a bit of challenge to the idea that we're autonomous. Our reliance on each other and our inescapable connection have become terribly visible in the light of the pandemic. As the pandemic began, we couldn't help but notice that our so-called autonomy relied on fragile global supply chains for food and for medicine, on people willing to care for others and to offer service to others at life-threatening danger to themselves, on a communal vision of how to behave, which meant that every personal choice we made had to be assessed in terms of its potential impact on other people. We also noticed that we missed the connections we couldn't make anymore because they were dangerous, with the more fragile members of our families, with friends, with our local communities. It wasn't until we couldn't visit care homes or elderly people or hug people outside our immediate household that we noticed how much we needed those things, how much we needed other people in order to thrive. So everything we had invisibly depended on so invisibly we were beginning to forget that we even were dependent, came starkly into view in March 2020. We can imagine ourselves as separate and self-supporting and all the rest of it, but actually we really are infinitely obliged. And our climate crisis is showing us the same thing. When we assess the value of land or trees or oceans or species only in terms of their potential monetization for private gain, we endanger everything we depend upon in order for us to survive. Even if we didn't care about the world because it is the world, extraordinary and complex and beautiful, we have perfectly good human-centered reasons to care. Even if we have no sense of empathy with those already suffering as a result of climate change, we have perfectly good selfish reasons to notice our webs of obligation and tread more lightly. And even if we don't have a strong sense of religious reverence and overarching source of all good we might call God, we might have very urgent reasons to reverence the creation for the good of humanity. So this isn't just a good time to think about our networks of infinite obligation. It's an urgent one, a last chance moment. So that took me back to the idea of being run by desire. I'd started off my thinking in relation to sexual desire and its fulfillment, and my particular generation is one in which sexual desire got an apparently much freer run than it had done for generations before me. I grew up at the height of sexual liberation, though well before the dominance of the internet. But in growing up, I had to notice that sexual freedom didn't seem to mean liberation for all on quite the same terms. It seemed to be set up so that it was only costless if you were a man in a position of power. Also, although the rhetoric of sexual freedom constructed it as a kind of mutual gift-giving without the hampering bonds of ongoing relationship responsibility or family, it wasn't working out that way. Sexual desire was a heavily monetized commodity then, as it is now. It was used to sell almost all products, so it was inevitable that the human body would itself become a kind of commodity. That on its own fatally undermined the idea of sexual encounter as a gift. And the power play of society in general, where the well-off and the socially dominant could coerce the more vulnerable, meant that sexual encounter was frequently coercive, with women, the young, and the poor left exposed to abuse. The mass monetization of desire, often through sexual metaphor, but spreading to other pleasure as well, pushed us human beings towards short-term fulfillments and away from the longer vistas of desire, the intangibles of love or community or wider, more collective visions of human flourishing. The promises of fulfillment in society, not only sexually, but in a whole raft of ways in relation to travel, for example, or consumer goods or mind-altering substances, come to that, whether by that we mean coffee or cocaine, were driving our consumer-dominated culture so that people were being encouraged to settle for short-term pleasures and to be careless of slower, more intangible or more patient experiences of what it might be to be human. It drove and drives our supply chains for goods, whether in the garment industry, where the enslaving of the poor and the destruction of the environment still go hand in hand, and the demand for infinite choice in our consumption of foodstuffs, where it built up systems which made food waste inevitable, exploitative employment highly likely, and was indifferent to habitat destruction, environmental damage, and human misery. The histories of our luxury foodstuffs, whether by that we mean chocolate or sugar or coffee, is a history with a lot of human misery hidden in it. The history of the human relationship with other sources of bodily pleasure, from drugs to sex to the music industry, is similarly laced through with corruption and violence. It seemed as if our insistence upon autonomy itself based on a transactional system of exchange which favoured the powerful, wasn't working that well. We had valuable ideas of gift, whether in our private sexual relationships or in our visions of human community, but we didn't seem very good at working out how to live them. At the time that I was writing Holiness and Desire, I was looking particularly at the desires of the body and looking at those desires through the lens of the bodily pleasures which dominated society in my own growing up, which was particularly sex. And sex was quite an interesting area for thinking about obligation, because effectively, over the course of my lifetime, sexual activity became redefined. It was redefined away from being a public choice with public, readily visible consequences to it, to being a private good, something that individuals made choices about without considering the effects of their decisions on anyone but themselves. In practice, people do something in between those two, really. But I think that still probably describes where people think of it now, as a private choice. Like all individual freedoms, though, the privatization of sex comes with a price. And my sense is that the price tag is often both invisible and pretty expensive. I found myself arguing that for many, sexual encounter was a form of bargain, in which you found out the other person's price and matched it to what you were prepared to pay, whether in terms of a mutual understanding of consent or the mutually agreed limits of the relationship's emotional engagement, or the responsibility people were prepared to take for each other. I looked at apparently very simple things like thinking about how we look at each other with desire before we ever think about touching. I looked at the rise of gaze theory across the 20th century, whether by that we're talking about Laura Mulvey's theory of the male gaze as objectifying women's bodies, or Foucault's theories about the gaze of the powerful upon the vulnerable in institutions of punishment like prisons, or in situations of unequal power like the relations of doctor to patient. With the rapid rise of technologies, which allowed us to look at people without them necessarily being able to look back, electronic screens, film, and so on, we seem to be constructing a way of interacting with the world, which didn't know whether it behaved in real-world ways, like a genuine encounter, or in fictive ways, like a thought or a piece of private imagination. The massive dominance of digital pornography, along with the business model it used, which was essentially a free at first point of use system with addictive algorithms nudging users into more extreme paid for content, fueled a system with hardly any checks or balances against abuse. Built up on what it called amateur content, in other words, not paid for, there were very few ways of checking up on exploitative practice. There were, and there are, issues around whether people portrayed within pornography had consented to the use of their images in that way, whether they'd been coerced, whether they'd been paid properly or at all, how old they were. Meanwhile, pornographic content itself, even in categories defined as mainstream, was unrealistic in its violence and its extremity as it catered to ever more jaded, used to it tastes. And I've been struck since publishing Holiness and Desire, how some of those issues have surfaced during the last year. I'm thinking of the struggle some people have to regain control over the circulation of their images, which were privately exchanged electronic images and films, once part of private relationships, when they've emerged on porn sites or been circulated informally. This is happening to children and teenagers as well as adults, with stories on the BBC, for example, of 14-year-old girls persuaded to send boys pictures which they then circulate around the school and inevitably escape beyond it. The evidence emerging from Everyone's Invited is disturbing, as is the growing body of evidence that the dominance of porn on the internet gives children growing up with it unrealistic and dangerous expectations of what they can do to each other's real bodies in real encounters. There is a very funny but quite telling New Zealand advert in which two porn stars knock on a teenage boy's door and tell him, in front of his mum, that what they do is not real and he shouldn't assume that any relationship he makes with a real person will be like the stuff he's looking at. I looked too at social media spaces within which we look at each other. Why we were so anxious to be seen to live our lives that we posted everything we did online as if real life were only to be found there. But at the same time, we were treating online spaces as if we could be more careless of each other's feelings on it, as if what we did online was not quite real. Over the last year, we've perhaps got a bit better at valuing encounters in person, because we haven't had many, and also at treating online encounters as having some of the weight, some of the importance of in-person ones. When our doctor's appointments and our committee meetings and our family get-togethers all have to be online, it's quite difficult to treat online as an unreal space in which it doesn't matter what we say or do. And at the same time, I think we all know now that virtual hugs really don't substitute for the real thing. I've talked quite a lot so far about the misuse of desire for short-term gain. But what about holiness? And are there signs that we as a society have got some effective pushback against these systems which encourage us to treat the world as something to be mined for pure sensation? I think there are. In the Christian tradition to which I belong, there are what are sometimes called the two great commandments. And these are the two things that Jesus in conversation said encompassed all the law and the prophets. And they're very simple. They are to love God with all your heart, soul, strength and mind, and to love your neighbour as yourself. And when you take them together, these two understandings of relationship situate every human being relationally, rather than being stranded all alone, looking for sensations to try and make yourself feel a bit less lonely. I think it's quite interesting that gaze theory evolved out of a philosophical position, trying to understand how it might feel when there was no God to look at you, keep you in mind and in sight. If, on the other hand, there is an intangible belief in the good, in justice, in love, in the obligations we owe to each other and to our fragile world, we've got something to lift our eyes to, which seems a little more worthwhile than the endless search for something new to feel. And if we were to treat our encounters with other people as encounters with people whose feelings and identity were exactly as real as our own, then the gratification of desire might be much more complicated, much less simple, but it would also be guaranteed to be part of a properly real encounter, something with all the weight of a relationship. Of course, only a very few of our relationships can have a deep intimacy because we're just finite people. But the imaginative work of respect and care are part of how we live well together. Without them, we pine away. I think there are lots of signs that we are rediscovering the long vista of desire, the value of that gap between wanting and having. We're finding again the slow pleasures, whether of engagement with the natural world in gardening or walking, bird watching, in craft, with the rise of the slower healing pleasures of knitting, for example, or in our renewed interest in living more lightly and less exploitatively as we come to terms with the extent of our climate crisis. I think we know better than we used to that we are infinitely obliged. I hope we can value our desires as something which lifts our eyes beyond immediate gratification towards a longer view with more ambitious aims which are not just or even mainly about personal satisfactions, but about a future which values and cares about common goods, mutual care, living respectfully and gently, being open to a sense of the blessings of this whole world as a gift. I'm going to end with an image by the painter Giotto, And he's showing a scene from the New Testament, the point where one of Jesus's followers, a woman called Mary Magdalene, stands weeping by his tomb after he's died, because she thinks his corpse has been stolen and it's just the last straw in her grief. But then she discovers that the reason there's no body in the tomb is because Jesus isn't dead. He's alive. He has been raised, say the angels to her. And she's overjoyed and she reaches out to touch him. But Jesus says, don't. It's mysterious why he doesn't allow her to hold on to him. And that mysterious moment, just on the brink of holding on to someone deeply desired, holding out your hands to them, has been captured in many paintings, as it is in this one. It seems a fitting image for a desire which is held just at that moment before fulfillment, which is full of joy. Perhaps in reaching out for the thing which is just beyond our fingertips, we raise our eyes to something more important, something we never knew was there till we looked up. Perhaps our desire is really our greatest treasure. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you so much for an amazingly rich and thoughtful presentation. Where to begin? Let's talk about the manipulation of desire in a world run by desire, and to use your phrase, the mass monetization of desire, trying to sell us what we think we want. Do you think that we've become driven by desire and exploited through our desire? Are we creatures of consummation?
The really quick answer to that is yes, I do think so. And of course, if you are thinking about the monetization of desire, you think about the shortest possible distance between somebody deciding that they would like a thing and something that approximates to that thing being delivered to them. Think how important it is, you know, if you're if you join Prime on Amazon, that you get your thing next day. You're not waiting for it. And if somebody wants something quite complicated or quite hard to achieve, then you can't deliver very many of them and you can't price them in a way that will give you a profit. But if you give them something that's a little bit like it, but much cheaper and much faster to deliver, then of course you can make a profit out of it. And even though they might be rather disappointed by the thing that they get, they do get that moment in which they think they might have got it. And in the meantime, of course, you've got some money you can put in the bank.
That's one of the questions we've had already, actually. It's where does the motivation for monetization come from? And who is actually in charge of all this? Who is making the money out of our desire?
Everybody. It is the system by which we live. Because we are we have a rather crude value system, which is a system which monetizes almost every kind of good, including some imaginary ones. I was absolutely fascinated watching the captioning, which is fairly approximate, managed to render fragile world as franchised world, and I thought that was just great. I've kind of more or less answered the question about who is doing it. We have a system where people survive if they find a monetary value for something and then can sell it in a way that means that they've got some money left over to buy something else. And therefore we don't have, although we have other ways of valuing things, and we talk quite a lot about those ways, we don't necessarily treat them with the seriousness that we treat the social imaginary we call money. I mean, money is a completely imaginary idea, but we take it so seriously that people can die for the lack of it. And that is how we run our world.
And it's a well-worn answer, really, but from our own faith perspective, of course, most of the parables in the Gospels are about money rather than sex. So maybe Jesus did know what he was talking about. Just moving on from that, you raised some really challenging issues about culture and the way culture has shifted, especially during lockdown. A recent report, I think it was just last week, suggested that 50% of adults have accessed pornography on the internet during lockdown. And we've seen in the past week a major Ofsted report saying that 90% of girls experience sexual harassment at school, and that it's so normal that they don't even bother to report it. So you did challenge on this issue and kind of expose it. So can you comment on that a bit further?
Two different things. So the question of accessing pornography online when you're in lockdown, people are on their own. Or lots of people have been on their own. And I looked at some of the analytics that were published by Pornhub, which is one of the biggest of the porn sites. And one of the things that was really striking about those analytics is that people access porn when there's nothing else going on. So if there's a really big national event, porn use goes down. If there's a sports event that everyone's going to, porn use goes down. On Sundays, when there's not so much going on, porn use goes right up. So I'm not surprised that there's been more use of porn when a lot of people have not been able to have human interactions. Of course, they still haven't had a human interaction, but they might. It is a way towards feeling you might have begun to. I think the other issue, the Ofsted report, in some ways is more disturbing, and suggests that less has changed than I hoped had when I was writing the book, because it suggests that there's still a kind of normalized exploitation, which boys and girls are both caught up in. And I was really struck that the head of the Magdalen College School, which was where the Everyone's Invited website kind of began its invitation, said, please don't criminalize boys because this is happening, because all they're doing is responding to a wider culture of exploitation, which is absolutely everywhere. And I think it's very much hidden by a rhetoric of if you like, sort of equal sexual opportunity, which is not really quite what's happening on the ground.
There's a couple of questions that have come in, both related to aspects of what we've been discussing. The first is a way that we tend to look, the suggestion is in the Western religious traditions, of a separation between flesh and holiness, or a sort of bodily experience and a holy experience as being sort of mutually exclusive. So do you want to reflect on that one first, and then we'll come back to some economic issues?
I think that's a really interesting one. I've been thinking about it in another context, the way in which we're kind of implicitly dualist about how we think about ourselves. There is a strand which has been really strong in the Christian tradition, and I think perhaps is particularly strong in Protestantism, which separates out the body and the soul, if you like, more than is really quite realistic or comfortable. It's as if it's a kind of drive towards the intangible as a source of purity, rather than having the kind of mixed messiness of the way we actually are, which is embodied with all the kind of compromises and complications that go with that. And I think that in the early years of Christianity, so long before there was any Protestantism, there was also a very strong sense that that engaging with the desires of the world pulled you into various kinds of inevitably exploitative practices. So asceticism, I think, the refusal of all the desires of the flesh, looked like a way to become closer to God and not so caught up in those things. But actually, it's not what you find in the Gospels in a straightforward way at all. You know, Jesus is constantly being criticized for having meals when he ought to be fasting, or, you know, spending his time with people who are ritually unclean, or whose lives are less than squeaky clean. So he was constantly mixing things in a way that didn't seem to go with the purity code at all. I think it's much more complicated to live well than to decide that all the desires of the flesh are a bad thing.
And I'm going to take us sort of round back to questions about economics and capitalism. There's a question here about whether we should sound a more cautionary note about being entirely negative in relation to the monetization of desire, reflecting on the fact that currently managed markets and economic systems, with all the faults that we know they have done things to alleviate poverty and provide healthcare, but it's a complex and messy system, I guess, that we're examining.
Absolutely, and it's not one I'm very conscious that it's not one that that I have the expertise to examine properly. Of course, when you assign value, which is what monetization is, then you are assigning value to something that should have value. It's a question of how nuanced a system it can be, and what sorts of checks and balances you build into it. I mean, most economic models attempt to kind of predict what checks and balances are going to be necessary for, you know, the greatest good of the greatest number, I suppose. And none of those systems are perfect. If you don't have a way of valuing or of the comparative valuation of different kinds of good, it's extremely difficult to run any sort of transactional system. And we can't manage without transactional systems. I think my sense of trouble is when we have reductive transactional systems, which are the only kinds of value that in the end have any power.
In terms of your background in English literature, there's a lovely question which asks, apart from the Bible, do you think any works of fiction are good guides to relationships, and that's and how we view relationships and the monetization of relationships? So it's a really broad question about what other sources might shed light on the questions that you've been raising.
Oh wow, that's a huge one. I did a section in the book which looked at essentially at the novel and the rise of the novel, and particularly at the construction of novels, or before that of theatrical comedies which ended with marriages, which are usually, to a greater or lesser extent, an attempt to reconcile marriage as a transactional system, which is what it, you know, at bottom is, and marriage as a system of mutual gift, which it isn't as often as you might think. And to do that, to, you know, make true love and economics work out well together, is the preoccupation of a great many books, whether you are talking about Jane Eyre or the novels of Anthony Trollope, or whether you're talking about the comedies of Shakespeare. They're all trying to work out how on earth you reconcile economic necessity or economic desires and other kinds of desire.
And in terms of, if you like, the right and healthy use of our sexual desires and the relationships that we build, does the church, because you've worked with the House of Bishops on producing a report for the Church of England, exploring some of these issues about sexuality, does the church need to do more to celebrate the diversity of, if you like, sexual desires and bodies and embodiment?
I certainly felt, I mean, I've been sitting on these committees for a really long time, for nearly 10 years now. And I certainly felt when I came into the conversation first that it was very anxious and very reductive. And it was actually piling a whole raft of anxieties onto one single issue, which was really about, essentially, it was about gay marriage. And actually, what needed to happen was that a much broader conversation needed to be had about what the privatization of sexual desire meant about people paying attention to each other, people bearing the right kinds of responsibility for each other, and people encountering each other with sort of kindness and recognition. I do think that as the church has gone on having these conversations, it's got better at thinking about those things. And it's also tried quite hard, often in sort of artificial and clunky ways, but tried quite hard to think about how you run a community where people are not going to agree about this stuff. How do you live well together with your neighbour who totally, frantically disagrees with you on an issue? And that's something that our wider society has a problem with in all kinds of areas, not just sexuality. And it may be that in attempting to model something decent there, the church is doing something honourable, even if it doesn't always work very well.
And I think we are living currently in a culture where there is a lot of fractiousness about all kinds of issues, whether it's Brexit or how we're exiting COVID, or I mean, you could think of anything. So I think, I suppose any process that enables us to speak to one another face to face is a good thing to be part of. In a related way, there's a question here about our evolving relationship with social media, and the possible relation to the rise in consumption, the kind of I see it so I want it, and also the desire to gaze into other people's lives. You talked about social media, and particularly the way we've been using it in lockdown, and platforms like this, which have been a great benefit to many of us, but they've also perhaps made all of us ask questions about what's going on beyond the screen.
Yeah. Like lots of people, I think I'm quite conflicted about this. I have been as reliant as everyone else on the kinds of human connection that have been possible through this sort of video conferencing, for example. I do think there are some safeguards in this kind of interactive relationship, because we may not be in the same space, but we are responding to each other, and we do know that each other is there. I recognise that there are 41 people on this call, and that I can only see one of them. But I know that everybody's there. I know that people are hearing, and they have a way to respond. So it is interactive, and I think it has got some rules of civility around it, which people understand and are keeping to, and we're treating it like a real space, even though it hasn't got any kind of spatial boundary that's clear. I think what I get more worried about is where people are using both where people are using interactive spaces as if they were the insides of their own head. So you feel anger or frustration or rage, and you vent it on this person who isn't really a person, because they're just a little bit of the inside of your own head, because they're on your screen in your computer, so they're not really real. But of course they are. I'm really astonished at how common and how it is, and how quickly people get to the point where they say, why don't you kill yourself, or why it would be better if you were dead. Can you imagine saying that to someone in front of you? And yet it seems, you know, I've got a 15-year-old, and you know, those are comments that come up all the time in social interaction. just can't imagine how you would ever say that to a real person who you thought was really there. So I think people forget that they're talking to real people when on social media. And I think the other kind of quite disturbingly imbalanced kind of looking is the sort of looking where you're looking at people who can't look back, where you're actually sort of silent and invisible, but sort of watching somebody else. There's nothing mutual about that. So I think it needs to be really carefully bounded. When we watch a film, we know it's securely fictive, and that's the only way that it's okay to watch that stuff. You know, you wouldn't watch a sex scene if it was really your neighbor in bed with his wife, I trust. But you might think it was perfectly fine to do that as part of the fictive story of a film. So I think sometimes there aren't very good boundaries, particularly with a lot of the kind of reality genres, where you don't really know whether what you see is real or not real. And that's part of the charge of it. You know, these are people's real lives I'm watching. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, if it is people's real lives you're watching, perhaps you need to be more careful.
You talked a lot about sort of carefulness and the networks of infinite obligation, which is an amazing way to think about how we are connected with communities, with our neighbours. You also said that this is our last chance moment to think about those networks of infinite obligation. That sounds quite scary. Why is it so important that we address this and we act now?
I was thinking about the climate change crisis, of course, because if you like, the kind of organizational challenge of climate change, which is that it is global, that you cannot just say, this hasn't come to me yet, and I don't care if some Pacific islands are sinking, or if the glaciers are melting, because the glaciers are a long way away. So although it will arrive for everybody in a way that will be disastrous for human beings in general, not to mention everything else on the planet, those people for whom who are doing the most wasting are also the people it will touch last. So unless people are really clear about being in a network of infinite obligation, and therefore work with a hitherto unprecedented global cooperation, we are in real trouble. And I think global cooperation only happens when everyone thinks, my goodness, this is urgent.
You could say when everyone loves their neighbour as themselves.
Yes, exactly.
That was my segue into asking you to reflect on the incarnate God. So you're coming at this from a Christian perspective, and that we believe in an incarnate God, a God of flesh and blood, and obviously that representation, that's Jesus himself, who teaches us how to love and how to live. So do you think we still need to be shown that?
Yes, I do. And actually, I think there is a particular challenge for our current generation, because we're often disembodied. I feel as if I'm talking to you. I am talking to you as if you were kind of right next to me. But actually, I'm sitting on my own in my mother's house, just talking to the air. And I think that's absolutely fine. And I think so much of how we interact is strangely disembodied. But actually, we are fragile creatures who begin and end, who are reliant on each other for our food, for our shelter, for our well-being. And I think it's too easy to forget. And one of the things that really matters to me about the incarnational in Christianity is that it's not just about a God who's invisible and incredibly powerful and up there and disembodied and pure spirit and all that kind of thing. It is about a God who was absolutely, totally dependent on human beings for his survival, who was as fragile as any newborn baby could possibly be, and who went through all the pains that any human being could possibly experience. So this is something God knows about from the inside. And that's what I've got time for, if you see what I mean, rather than one that says, you should be doing better, from kind of up in some kind of celestial castle.
Your book's called Holiness and Desire. We've talked quite a lot about desire. What is holiness, Jessica?
The word literally means something like set apart. And I always have a bit of a problem with that idea of set apartness. But I have a lot of time for the sense that all the things that there are imbued with a sense of God's presence. So for me, holiness is living as if people and the stuff of the world are infinitely precious, which is surprisingly hard to do, and involves being very, very attentive to your context, your relationships, your disposition. Quite a lot of what the Judeo-Christian, in fact, all of the Abrahamic religions, the basis of how human beings are encouraged to live is actually praise. It's to say, you were made in order to rejoice in the stuff of life, which is quite extraordinary. You're put on this earth to praise, and I think that's holy living.
I think we've got time for one more question. I'm quoting you here, Jessica. Perhaps in reaching out for the thing which is just beyond our fingertips, we raise our eyes to something more important, something we never knew was there until we looked up. You talked about the gaze and the way we look at ourselves and the way we look at the world, and the way the world and others look around us. And you've also talked about the hope that you have, that human beings are in fact able to look up beyond themselves. Can you talk about the signs of hope that you see in the world today?
I think there are lots of signs of hope. I talked about some of them in my talk, and they sound like really small things, like us suddenly discovering that going for a walk is really valuable, or that paying sort of slow, patient attention to the natural world, which won't necessarily show itself in kind of blazing colours straight away, so you've got to wait. The rise of interest in things like cooking for yourself and thinking about how about global supply chains and how we source what we eat, thinking about our connectedness and what that might mean for how we do our transactions more thoughtfully. A lot of that is happening. In the course of my lifetime, in just thinking about the academic world, when I first went into it, there was a strong sense that people would do research in whatever subject it might be because they wished to know, not because it was useful for something or they could sell it, but because they wished to know more about this big complex world. And over the course of my lifetime, I think things have got much, much more utilitarian, so that you've had to prove that your knowledge is useful in some way, or you've had to, if you've got a scientific project, you've got to show how it will benefit a business, or how it will benefit, it will be of immediate benefit to humanity in some way. But most really extraordinary discoveries have been made much more by accident than that, just by kind of pure inquiry. And I think the spirit of pure inquiry is incredibly important, because it's one of the ways that you look up beyond your immediate needs. I think every time we look up beyond our immediate needs, we become more than ourselves. And I think there's a lot of it about. I see a lot of it about. And I think in some ways the pandemic has made us value the stuff immediately beyond our environment, to value the kind of the intangibles of love and care, and what the sky looks like, and what it's like to go for a walk when you haven't been able to go out all day. I hope we don't lose it all.
Jessica, thank you so much for a quite brilliant and challenging discussion and presentation, and for encouraging us all to lift up our eyes and be hopeful, even in the midst of the challenge that we're all in. The recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 20th of June. And you'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. If you would like to purchase a copy of Jessica's book, Holiness and Desire, it will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And for more information on book sales, please see the festival website or head direct to foxlanebooks.co.uk Festival of Ideas. We really hope that you will continue to be engaged with the York Festival of Ideas. Do check out the website, yorkfestivalofideas.com, for full details of all the remaining events in the festival programme. We'd love to hear your thoughts on all of the events and continue the conversations using the hashtag York Ideas. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening.